Richard Hawthorne adjusted his platinum cufflinks one final time before stepping into his private jet. At 58, he had built an empire worth over $200 million, transforming a small tech startup into a global conglomerate. His calendar was booked solid for the next 6 months, with board meetings in Tokyo, merger discussions in London, and acquisition talks in Dubai. Time was money, and Richard had mastered both. "Sir, we're ready for departure," his pilot announced through the intercom. Richard barely looked up from his tablet, where quarterly projections demanded his immediate attention. The flight to Denver for the Henderson Industries buyout was supposed to be routine. 2 hours in the air, sign the papers, and return home to Manhattan by evening. "Take off when ready," Richard replied curtly, his fingers dancing across the screen as he reviewed financial reports. This was his life: constant motion, endless deals, and the relentless pursuit of more. It had cost him his marriage 15 years ago, when Sarah had finally tired of competing with his business for his attention. But it was the other loss that haunted him most: Michael, his son. The boy had been 12 when Richard's work consumed him entirely, missing soccer games, parent-teacher conferences, and birthdays. Sarah had tried to bridge the gap, but Richard's absence spoke louder than his occasional promises to change. When the divorce finalized, Michael chose to live with his mother, and their relationship crumbled like a poorly constructed business deal. The last conversation with Michael had been 7 years ago, a bitter argument about money and priorities, that ended with his son hanging up and changing his phone number. Richard had tried reaching out through lawyers and private investigators, but Michael had vanished into deliberate obscurity. Sarah, now remarried and living somewhere on the West Coast, had made it clear that she wouldn't facilitate contact. Unless Michael wanted it. He never did. 3 hours into what should have been a 2-hour flight, Richard finally looked up from his work. Something felt wrong. The landscape below looked unfamiliar, rolling hills instead of Colorado's distinctive mountain ranges. He pressed the intercom button. "James, what's our ETA? This doesn't look like Colorado." There was a pause before. His pilot's voice crackled through, tinged with embarrassment. "Sir, I'm afraid I filed the wrong flight plan this morning. We're currently approaching Millbrook, Ohio. I mixed up the airport codes, MBK instead of Den. I sincerely apologize." Richard's jaw tightened. "How long until we can turn around?" "We need to land for fuel, sir. It'll be at least 3 hours before we can get back in the air, assuming we can get clearance today." The familiar surge of anger rose in Richard's chest, but as he looked down at the small Ohio town spread out below them, something unexpected happened. The rage dissipated into something else, a strange sense of déjà vu. Millbrook. Why did that name sound familiar? As they descended toward the small regional airport, Richard found himself studying the town's layout. Main Street cut through the center like a spine, with residential neighborhoods branching off in neat grids. A river wound along the eastern edge, and he could see what looked like a high school football stadium, its lights already glowing in the late afternoon sun. His phone buzzed. Text messages from board members, missed calls from his assistant, and a string of increasingly urgent emails about the Denver meeting. But for the first time in years, Richard found himself ignoring them. Instead, he pressed his face to the small window and watched Millbrook grow larger as they approached. The landing was smooth, and soon Richard found himself standing on unfamiliar tarmac in a town he'd never intended to visit. The small terminal. Building looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s, complete with wood paneling and faded motivational posters. A handful of locals sat in plastic chairs, reading newspapers or scrolling through their phones. "Sir," James said, approaching with obvious discomfort, "I've spoken to the tower. We can refuel, but there's a storm system moving in from the west. They're recommending we wait until morning for safety." Richard stared at his pilot, processing this latest complication. A full day lost, millions of dollars potentially at stake, and he was stranded in some forgotten Ohio town. His instinct was to demand they take off anyway, weather be damned, but something held him back. Maybe it was exhaustion from years of constant pressure, or perhaps the strange familiarity of this place he couldn't shake. For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard Hawthorne, a man who hadn't taken an unplanned break in 20 years, heard himself say, "Fine. Book us rooms somewhere decent. We'll leave in the morning." As he watched the sun set over Millbrook's quiet streets, Richard had no idea that this flight mistake would change everything. The Millbrook Inn wasn't the Four Seasons, but Richard had to admit it possessed a certain rustic charm he'd forgotten existed. His room overlooked Main Street, where the evening was settling in with a peace that felt almost foreign after decades of city life. The silence unnerved him more than any hostile takeover ever had. Unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Richard found himself walking down Main Street at 9 p.m. Most shops were closed, their windows dark except for the warm glow of security lights. He passed Harper's Hardware, Millbrook Diner, and a small bookstore called Chapter and Verse. The normalcy of it all felt like stepping into a museum exhibit of small-town America. The only place showing signs of life was O'Malley's Pub, its neon beer signs casting colorful reflections on the wet pavement from an earlier shower. Richard hesitated at the door. When was the last time he'd been in a regular bar? His social drinking happened at exclusive clubs and corporate events, always with an agenda. The interior was exactly what he expected: dark wood, vintage beer signs, and a handful of locals nursing their drinks while watching baseball highlights on a mounted TV. The bartender, a burly man with graying hair and kind eyes, looked up as Richard entered. "Evening, stranger. Don't think I've seen you around before." "Just passing through," Richard replied, settling onto a bar stool. "Flight got diverted. Scotch. Neat. Top shelf." The bartender, his name tag read Danny, smiled apologetically. "Well, our top shelf might not be what you're used to, but it'll do the job." He poured a generous measure of Jameson. "What? Brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" Richard found himself oddly comfortable talking to this stranger. Maybe it was the scotch, or maybe it was the genuine interest in Danny's eyes, so different from the calculated networking conversations that usually filled his evenings. "Business deal fell through," Richard said, which was close enough to the truth. "First unplanned stop I've made in years." "Sometimes those are the best kind," Danny replied, wiping down glasses. "I'm Danny O'Malley, by the way. My family's owned this place for 30 years. "Richard." He paused, then decided against his last name. In this place, it carried no weight anyway. As the evening progressed, Richard found himself drawn into conversations with the other patrons. There was Margaret, a retired teacher who'd taught at Millbrook High for 40 years. Tom, who owned the hardware store and knew every resident's home repair needs by heart. And Sarah, not his ex-wife, but a young nurse who worked at the county hospital and was saving money to go back to school for her master's degree. For the first time in decades, Richard was just another person in a bar, not a CEO or a deal maker or a millionaire. The anonymity was intoxicating. "You know," Margaret said during a lull in conversation, "you remind me of someone. There was a teacher at the high school, Michael Carson. He had the same eyes, same way of holding himself. Course he's younger than you, probably early 30s now." Richard's blood went cold. Michael Carson. His son had taken Sarah's maiden name after the divorce. "This Michael," he managed, his voice carefully neutral. "He's still around?" "Oh, yes. Wonderful young man. Teaches English and coaches the debate team. Kids just love him. Never married, though we keep hoping. He's got a house over on Elm Street, number 47. The scotch turned to acid in Richard's mouth. His son, the boy he'd driven away with his obsessive pursuit of success, was living less than a mile from where he sat. Teaching, of all things. Richard remembered Michael's love of books, how he'd write stories and read them aloud until Richard had told him to focus on more practical subjects. "You all right, friend?" Danny asked, noticing Richard's pale complexion. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Richard whispered. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Richard excused himself and walked back to the inn, his mind reeling. 7 years of wondering, of guilt, of assuming he'd never see his son again. And here, Michael was a 30-minute flight mistake away from Richard's planned route. Back in his room, Richard stood at the window, staring in the direction of Elm Street. He could drive there right now, knock on the door, try to explain. But explain what? That his flight got diverted? That he'd stumbled into Michael's life by accident after years of failed attempts to reconnect? His phone buzzed with another urgent email from his assistant. The Denver deal was falling apart without him there. Board members were asking questions. Stock prices were fluctuating on rumors of his absence. None of it seemed to matter. Richard had spent 20 years building an empire, accumulating wealth and power that most people could only dream of. But sitting in that small inn room, he realized he'd lost the only thing that truly mattered. His son was here, in this forgotten town, building a life that Richard knew nothing about. The question that kept him awake until dawn wasn't about business, or money, or deals. It was simpler and more terrifying than anything he'd ever faced in a boardroom. Did he have the courage to knock on that door? And if he did, would Michael even want to see him? Richard barely slept. By 6 a.m., he was dressed and pacing his small hotel room, rehearsing conversations that seemed increasingly inadequate. What do you say to a son you haven't spoken to in 7 years? How do you apologize for choosing profit? Margins over parent-teacher conferences for missing the moments that mattered? He walked to Millbrook Diner for breakfast, hoping the familiar ritual of morning coffee might steady his nerves. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Betty, poured his coffee before he even asked. "You're the fellow whose plane got mixed." "Up yesterday," she said with a knowing smile. "Word travels fast in a town this size. Margaret O'Brien called this morning. She's the retired teacher you met at O'Malley's. Said you might know Michael Carson." Richard's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. We used to know each other. Haven't seen him in years." "Well, you're in luck. He comes in every Saturday morning around 8 for his usual. Stack of pancakes and black coffee, sits right there in that corner booth, grading papers or reading. Creature of habit, that one." Richard glanced at his watch, 7:45. His heart hammered against his ribs. He could leave right now, get on his plane, and pretend this never happened. Return to his scheduled life of meetings and acquisitions and carefully managed success. Instead, he ordered pancakes he didn't want and waited. At exactly 8 o'clock, the diner's bell chimed. Richard looked up and felt the world shift on its axis. Michael had inherited Sarah's warm brown eyes and gentle mouth, but his jawline and the way he carried himself were pure hawthorn. He was taller than Richard remembered, broader in the shoulders, with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and he wore a simple sweater and jeans that probably cost less than Richard's tie. He was beautiful. Michael moved toward his usual booth, a stack of papers tucked under one arm and a paperback novel in his hand. He was 3 steps past Richard's table when he stopped, recognition dawning slowly across his features. "Dad?" The word hung in the air between them like a bridge that might collapse at any moment. Richard stood, his legs unsteady. "Hello, Michael." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The diner continued its morning rhythm around them, coffee pouring, bacon sizzling, conversations continuing. But Richard heard none of it. "What are you doing here?" Michael's voice was carefully neutral, betraying nothing. "My plane got diverted. Wrong airport code." Richard's words sounded absurd even to him. "I had no idea you were here." "Margaret mentioned your name last night and I..." I couldn't believe it. Michael's jaw tightened. So this is just coincidence. You weren't looking for me. I stopped looking 7 years ago, Richard admitted, the honesty cutting through him, like glass. After our last phone call, I thought you never wanted to see me again. I didn't. Michael's response was immediate, but something flickered across his face. I don't know if I do now. Betty appeared beside them, coffee pot in hand, reading the tension. Why don't you boys sit down? I'll bring another cup. Michael hesitated, then slid into the booth across from his father. Richard sat carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment. You look good, Richard said quietly. Teaching suits you. Don't. Michael's voice was sharp. Don't make small talk like we're strangers who just happen to bump into each other. Then what do you want me to say? I don't know. Michael's composure cracked slightly. I used to imagine this moment. What I'd say if I ever saw you again. But now you're here and I don't know. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, removing a worn photograph. Michael, at age 10, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a trophy from his school's writing contest. I've carried this everywhere for 20 years, even after we stopped talking. Michael stared at the photo, his eyes glistening. You missed the award ceremony. I know. I missed everything that mattered. Why? The question came out broken. Why was everything else more important than me? Richard had rehearsed answers to this question for years, justifications about providing for his family, building security, for their future. But sitting across from his son, all those explanations crumbled into dust. Because I was scared, he whispered. I was terrified of failing, of not being enough, of ending up like my own father. A man who worked himself to death and left nothing behind. So I threw myself into work, thinking if I could just make enough money, build something big enough, I could protect you from ever feeling that kind of fear. But you weren't there to protect me from anything else. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Michael. They sat in silence, the weight of 7 years pressing down on them. Finally, Michael spoke. I became a teacher because of Mrs. Patterson. Remember her? 3rd grade. She was there when you weren't. She came to my plays, helped with my science projects, listened when I talked about the stories I wanted to write. I wanted to be that person for other kids. I remember her. She sent me updates about your progress. Richard's voice was barely audible. I saved every report card, every school picture. I know that doesn't make up for not being there, but I never stopped caring. Michael looked out the diner window at the familiar streets of Millbrook. I used to hate you, really hate you, but somewhere along the way it just became sadness. I grieved you like you died because, in a way, you had. I'm here now. For how long? Until your business calls? Until the next deal comes up? Richard pulled out his phone and without hesitation turned it off. Then he removed the battery. I was supposed to close a $200 million acquisition yesterday. My board is probably in panic mode. Stock prices are likely fluctuating, and I don't care. Michael stared at the dismantled phone. You always cared about that stuff? More than anything. Not anymore. Richard looked directly into his son's eyes. I spent 20 years building an empire and losing everything that mattered. I don't want to lose any more time. They talked for 3 hours. About Michael's students, his love of teaching, the novel he was writing in his spare time. About Richard's realization that all his success meant nothing without people to share it with. About the mother they both missed in different ways, and the years they couldn't get back. When they finally left the diner, the sun was high and warm. Michael walked Richard to his rental car. I don't know if we can fix this, Michael said, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Neither do I, but I'd like to try. Michael nodded, slowly. Maybe. Maybe you could come back sometime, when it's not an accident. I'd like that. Or maybe you could visit New York. See what your old man has built, for better or worse. Maybe. Richard started the car, then rolled down the window. Michael, I'm proud of you. The man you've become, the work you're doing. I should have said that years ago. As Richard drove away, he watched Michael in his rearview mirror until he disappeared around a corner. For the first time in decades, Richard Hawthorne wasn't thinking about his next meeting or his quarterly projections. He was thinking about his son, and the possibility that some mistakes, even the biggest ones, might not be beyond redemption. The flight mistake that had seemed like such a disaster just 24 hours ago now felt like the most important. Wrong turn he'd ever taken. Sometimes getting lost is the only way to find your way home.